When most watch geeks hear cocktail time, this is usually what comes to mind. This absolutely breathtaking textured sunburst dial that's then paired with a retro-domed hardlux crystal and a 40.5mm sized case, which, to be fair, is a tad large for a dress watch, and almost tragically so, because this is one of the very few complaints against this watch. After I reviewed the blue SRPE45J1, which is also known as the Blue Moon, I thought I was pretty much done with cocktail time, since they all seem to have the same case, the same dial texture, as well as the same dial layout. I thought I knew pretty much everything I needed to know about the collection, and never really looked back. That is until I ran into the watch we're going to cover today, the SRPE45, which is also more commonly known as the Mojito. Now, the Mojito, along with a few of its colorway cousins, are kind of an outlier in the cocktail time collection, as they're not only smaller at 38mm, but they also have a completely different dial design and texture. In fact, I think the Mojito actually reminds me more of, say, a super elegant Timex Marlin than, say, the original Cocktail Time from Seiko. It's elegant, eye-catching, a little bit retro, and above all, a very interesting affordable timepiece. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time, and today, it's Mojito time. Now, before we really jump into this one, I need to point out that the stock strap is not on backwards here. Because whenever I show a strap like this, I always get comments about it. It looks like it is, but trust me, it's not on backwards. It's just that the Mojito comes with a deployant clasp, and this is just how Seiko has those set up. Now, that said, let's move on to the specs. One of the biggest and most consistent complaints against the other Cocktail Time watches is their size. For many, 40.5mm is just way too big for a dress watch. However, that is less of a problem here with the Mojito, as it's only 38mm wide, as well as a lug-to-lug of just over 45. So I wouldn't say that it's sized like a vintage dress watch, but it's definitely more of a traditional sized one. And as such, it should be a fairly comfortable watch, even for those with slimmer wrists. Thickness, you're looking at 12mm, but a lot of that is due to the domed box cut looking hardlux crystal, as well as the exhibition case back. The actual body of the case has a fairly slim profile when you look at it, and I think it wears a little thinner than that as well. Otherwise, everything else here is fairly standard. 50 meters of water resistance, 20mm lug width, Seiko 4R35 movement, as well as its fairly light weight at around 63 grams on its leather strap. The case is 316L stainless, and for the most part, I'd say its design is fairly simplistic, and overall kinda dull compared to the dial contained. It's basically the same as just about every other Cocktail Time watch, just a tad smaller. The bottom of the lugs have a slight edge to them, but overall I'd say the finish is decent for the price. It's entirely polished, and that does include the clean bezel holding the crystal. In looking at it from this angle, you do have a bit of a multi-tiered effect, going from the case back to the case all the way to the bezel and the crystal, which does give that watch a bit of a vintage vibe. There can be a bit of glare, especially at the very outer edges of the crystal, but luckily the gold hands come through clearly in most situations. Honestly, the case is kind of boring, and it's mostly just acting as a frame holding everything together. There's nothing really memorable or interesting about it. I guess Seiko figures that your attention's gonna be so drawn to that dial that they really didn't have to do anything fancy with the case. On the right, you have a signed crown, which I think is a decent size. It doesn't stick out or distract too much, but it's always easy to pop out and manipulate. Moving to the back, we have the screw-down exhibition case back, which is pretty much what you'd expect here. It has all the particulars surrounding the crystal, and it also allows a glimpse of the movement. The only real surprise from this angle is the gold color skeletonized rotor attached to it. Now, back to the front, sitting right underneath that vintagey crystal is where things start to get interesting. I'm not exactly sure how many different colorways exist. I know of at least 5, some of which can get pretty interesting, like this pink tequila sunset version that Horology Insanity has, and he was kind enough to share some photos of it. But all the colorways seem to share the same breathtaking textured galoche dial, with this one in particular having a slight gradient going to black at the very outer edge. The other Cocktail Time watches are beautiful, but I mean, this one is just mesmerizing. I honestly can't get enough of these macro shots. They are just simply gorgeous. This Mojito is easily one of the most photogenic dials I've ever run across, as the gold applied indices and hands just pop out from that emerald dial underneath, making it all very easy to read, and especially with the detailed chapter ring at the very outer edge. Yet, the wonderful thing here is that as vibrant as the gold highlights tend to be, they still don't distract from the subtle textured patterns of the dial, and especially as they play with the light as it moves around. For the Mojito, Seiko decided to use a set of Delphine-style hands, which is fairly standard for a dress watch these days. And in general, I kind of have a love-hate relationship when it comes to Delphine hands. They tend to look great in the real world, but they are a pain to photograph. Typically, they're just angled, polished metal, which winds up being very reflective. And in a photo studio style setting, all they wind up doing is reflecting the darkness behind the camera, and they tend to get lost within the dial. However, Seiko does something ingenious with their Delphine hands, and not just here, but also on the standard Cocktail Time. Rather than have a pure polished handset, they split it down the middle, with one half polished and the other brushed, creating a handset that still has that beautiful classic style. It is much easier to make out in all situations. With this gold handset on the Mojito, it's not quite as much of an issue as it is with stainless. But it's still nice to see, because I think your eyes do tend to be drawn to that midpoint division in the hands, as each side does play with the light in its own way. Now, over at the right, we have a standard date window at the 3. And surprisingly, it's not the black date wheel that stands out and distracts, but rather it's the gold framing that brings the most amount of attention to the date. Generally, I do prefer a date on an everyday watch, but here, at least aesthetically speaking, I think Seiko would have been better off with a dateless dial. At the very top of the dial, you have an applied Seiko logo, and at the bottom, just above the 6, there is a small amount of printed text. The smaller text tends to blend into the design, but that Seiko logo boldly stands out, helping your eyes to properly orientate the watch just as much as it announces to the world what you are wearing. Overall, I like the design here a lot, but I am one that is drawn to more complicated dress watches, ones with both Arabics and chapter rings, which I know for some is kind of sacrilege, but I think it makes them easier to read and therefore more functional. And for me, that is also key to making them something I wear more often rather than just something I wear on special occasions. But just because that's what I prefer doesn't mean that's what everyone prefers, and I do realize that. So for those that want the simple, clean, classic dress watch, this is probably not going to be for you. It's just way too busy. In terms of movement, the Mojito uses a Seiko 4R35. And if you watch the channel regularly, this is a movement you've seen before and will undoubtedly see again. It's a fairly standard workhorse movement, and honestly it is quite fitting for the price. So let's talk about the stock strap. And just to be clear, this is not the stock strap, and that might tell you something. This is actually a strap from Vario that I think much better suits the watch. And that's because the stock strap, in true Seiko fashion, is absolute garbage. The stock strap is this cheap-looking brown leather version, and it does come with a deploying clasp, which is a plus, but otherwise it wears as bad as it looks. The back of the strap says it's calfskin, but honestly it feels and looks more like plastic. Although for me, the biggest problem about it is that it just looks horrible with the watch. The only real redeeming factor of the stock strap is that it has quick release, which means you can quickly take it off and then throw it in the trash. Seriously, just plan on replacing this thing as soon as you get it. It's stiff and just never really seems to break in. Swapping it to something that's a bit more flexible, and it makes all the difference, and especially on the wrist. At that point, this watch is truly a joy to wear, whereas with the stock strap, it's just awful. For a while, I was wearing it with this cheaper strap from Ritchie, just for a more casual look. But eventually I did wind up putting it on this distressed leather version from Vario, and I think this is the one I like the best. Lastly, let's talk value. Now, MSRP here is about $425, but street price is more around $330, which is pretty much what you expect from a Seiko these days. And like most other affordable Seikos out there, value is maybe okay, maybe. It's definitely not great when you look at the market as a whole. But again, that's just kind of how Seiko is these days. And it's definitely not great when you consider the Hardlux crystal and this crappy strap you're just going to throw out, rather than sapphire and good leather. However, what Seiko lacks in value these days, they more than make up for in creativity and originality. And for some, that's the most important thing. If you look almost anywhere else, you're going to find a watch that gives you a lot more bang for your buck, at least when it comes to the specs. But here, Seiko is a master of creating fantastic dials on affordable watches, and the Mojito is pure proof of that. So here it's really just a balancing act of whether or not you really like that dial enough that you can forgive those potential flaws. And unfortunately, that really does seem to be becoming a common theme with Seiko these days. In terms of comparable watches, there's really only one that I can think of that could be an alternative to the Mojito and its colorway cousins, and that would be the Empire series from Vario. This is another dress watch I love. It's a little bit different, but they still have that same great ornate Art Deco feel. The Empire comes with sapphire as well as a great strap, all for about the same price as the Mojito. Now, for those that prefer a simple, clean, classic dress watch, there are a lot of options out there, and especially with Seiko and Orient. However, if you're looking for something more interesting, more eye-catching, more elaborate, that's where the Mojito comes into play. Not only is it breathtakingly gorgeous, encapsulating a truly captivating presence in a compact package, but it's also surprisingly highly functional as well, making it potentially a perfect watch for the office bound. For me personally, I'm not really sure what I'm going to do with this one. I like it, and I really like it a lot, but the last thing I need is another dress watch that I don't wear. But where I was easily able to let go of that blue moon, I'm having a lot harder time deciding what to do with the Mojito. So we'll see. But in the meantime, let me know what you think about the Mojito, as well as its colorway cousins down below, as well as if you can think of another watch that does it better. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time. See you next time.